you shouldn't be surprised at all. Nothing is new under the sun. He talks about draining the swamp, Wall Street, and so on and so forth. And the first thing he did in 2017 was to appoint the CEO of Goldman Sachs as the Treasury Secretary. This is the modus operandi of the fascists. What they want is they want to have their cake and eat it. They want to devalue the dollar without jeopardizing the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, the reserve currency status of the dollar. Is this far-fetched? No, it's not far-fetched. He starts with the tariffs, and then in the one-on-one discussions with each of our leaders, hapless leaders, I should say, he demands different things from different people, depending on what they have to give him. Nobody is immune to the global fallout.
Yanis Varoufakis, welcome back to Politics Joe. Thank you for joining me, Ollie Dugmore, today. How would you like to introduce yourself before we get started?
A failed finance minister of a failed state in a failing Europe. How about that?
Yeah, not bad. I think that's a good way to start, and therefore making you eminently qualified to discuss what's happening right now, Yanis. I had so many different places to start. So much is happening. It just feels like the news becomes newsier and newsier every single day. Obviously, we're starting to see the immediate fallout of Liberation Day and the implication of the application of Trump's tariffs. Obviously, there are first order and second order consequences that are going to come way down the track. But right now, the markets are crashing. Should we be grateful in Britain? I appreciate we're speaking over Zoom that we appear to have gotten off lightly. We've only been whacked with 10% worth of tariffs.
Well, it is a small mercy, but then again, nobody is immune to the global fallout, and Britain has its own special inanities and weaknesses. You have an economy which has been, since Thatcher ravaged your manufacturing. Your economy has been founded on a Ponzi scheme based primarily on the financialization of people's homes and the financialization of the whole economy through the City of London. And that is simply not a sustainable model. It hasn't been sustainable for a while, but Donald Trump is making it absolutely clear that business cannot continue as usual in the United Kingdom, just as it cannot continue as usual in the European Union.
Isn't it that there appears to be, it might be a small part of the Venn diagram, but at least some crossover between the sort of the nationalist populists in America, led by the likes of Steve Bannon, and their economic messaging that essentially the status quo cannot continue, and that corporations have been taking advantage of and running roughshod over regular working class people in America, and some of the messaging that you would hear typically from the sort of the more socialist left here in the UK and Europe. Now, obviously, the diagnosis might be the same, but the cure and the prescription can be different. But it's been quite striking to me to see a figure on the right in the States talking about sort of the economic model in those terms.
Well, you shouldn't be surprised at all. Nothing is new under the sun. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the fascists and the Nazis began every single speech with a pretty clear and accurate depiction of capitalism's collapse. 20, 30 years ago, as in another lifetime when I was still an academic and I had the luxury of time and research and all that, for a book that I was writing, I had the difficult time of reading every speech that Joseph Goebbels delivered in the 1920s, in the 20s, not the 30s, early on. And I have to tell you that they were very interesting pieces of writing. Each one of them comprised 4 pages, exactly 4 pages. The first 2 pages were an analysis of the manner in which the collapsing financialized capitalism of the 1920s was destroying the working class in Germany. And I could have written it. It was brilliant. Until you come to the end of the second page. Remember, there are 4 pages. And then he starts continuing along the lines, taking it further by start blaming the Jew. And then the third page starts talking about the Holocaust, not so much the Holocaust, but, the preamble. to this weaponized misanthropy. So this is how fascists work. They take some basic analysis from the left, from the socialist left, and they use it in order to excite the imagination of the suffering working and middle classes, uh, drum up support, uh, talk about the banker and the capitalist and so on, in order to you know pinpoint the crux of the matter, who happens to be the Jew or today the Muslim or the asylum seeker, usurp power from the discontented, and then once they're in power, what they do inevitably, is they go into bed with the banker and the capitalist that they admonish in their speeches. Exactly the same thing that Donald Trump does. He talks about draining the swamp, Wall Street, and so on and so forth. And the first thing he did in 2017 was to appoint the CEO of Goldman Sachs as the Treasury Secretary. And today he took a hedge fund manager that was working with Joe Soros, shorting the Bank of England, to put him in that same position. So, let's not be surprised. This is the modus operandi of the fascist.
And previously as well, the Trump administration has been sensitive to Wall Street and the markets, and obviously the markets appear to be crashing, whether it's in Asia, America, or Europe. Do you think he's sensitive to it right now? Do you think he's and actually, I guess the more interesting question for me perhaps is how intentional do you think this is? Is it deliberately, is it a deliberate choice by the Trump administration to push the markets in this way with these tariffs? Do you think it has been thought through to that extent? And I guess what I'm sort of referencing here is the Mar-a-Lago Accord or reported Mar-a-Lago Accord.
Well, number of things that need to be unpacked from your question. Look, the first thing to remember is that his shotgun has two barrels. The first barrel shot already these massive tariffs, but there is a second barrel which he hasn't shot yet, and that contains a cartridge full of exorbitant tax cuts for fat cats. I will not be surprised, and nor should our audience be surprised, if when he shoots that second barrel, that second cartridge, the markets are going to go through another bout of irrational exuberance and triumph, recovering, and then, they'll be mates again. Look, as far as the Mar-a-Lago Accord is concerned, well, it was Stephen Miranda that coined that term. I don't believe that something's. By the way, let's unpack this for our audience. It harks back to something that happened in 1985 when Ronald Reagan was president, another Republican, who decided at some point that enough was enough. The American trade deficit, which was fine by the Republicans and the Democrats after the 1970s. This was the new business model after the end of Bretton Woods, after the United States ceased being a surplus country, because in the first 2 decades after the war, America was a surplus country. They were selling us a lot more than they were buying from us. And that was the basis of the golden age of capitalism, the period of the Bretton Woods system, where we had fixed exchange rates. I mean, think about it. The pound and the dollar had the same exchange rate day in, day out, year in, year out. You had interest rates fixed at around 5%, year in, year out. It was a very steady, constant, and stable world, as long as the Americans had surpluses. Then when they stopped having surpluses, Richard Nixon blew the whole thing up. And he did it for a very simple reason. Once you have deficits, either you go German, in other words, you tighten your belt, you go Austerian, big time, like the Germans would do, or they made us do. Or, and Nixon was not prepared to do that to his own people and to his own ruling class, to his own country, or you boost your deficits if you are the dominant hegemonic power, which is exactly what Nixon did, and you make other people pay for it. So essentially, the American deficit becomes the magnet that magnetizes into the United States both the net exports of the Germans, the Japanese, and the Chinese, and their money, which goes to New York, to Wall Street, to get recycled in the form of government debt, shares, and real estate. But at some point, by the mid 1980s, the Japanese in particular had become so accumulative when it came to all the dollars that they were accumulating in Tokyo as a result of selling so much stuff to the United States, that Reagan said, okay, well, no, I'll put an end to this. I will constrain the trade deficit that the United States has towards Japan. So Reagan convened at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, not far away from where Donald Trump was loitering, an international conference. He brought in the Germans, the French, the British, and so on, but effectively he only needed the Japanese there. This multilateral thing was for show. And essentially, he read the Riot Act to the Japanese. What Reagan said to the Japanese is really very simple. Either you revalue, you increase the value of the yen so that you make American exports to Japan cheaper and Japanese imports into America dearer, or I'm going to wipe the floor clean with you with huge tariffs. So he did that before he introduced tariffs, and the Japanese effectively caved. But of course, Japan was and remains a vassal of the United States. There are 85,000 American troops. Let's not forget in Okinawa, right? The Americans wrote the Japanese constitution, so it's not like China, for that matter. So when people talk about the Mar-a-Lago Accord, they're having this in mind of, Trump getting people together, like Reagan got together, in order to offer this deal. I will not tariff you out of existence if you revalue your currency, and we allow, therefore, together for the dollar to be devalued so that the American trade deficit can be reined in. That's the Mar-a-Lago Accord. Well, having said that, I don't think that's what he has in mind. He has something similar, but not the same thing. Firstly, Donald Trump, unlike Reagan, unlike all the other presidents before him, he loathes the idea of a large room full of foreigners. Germans, Greeks, and British. This multilateral thing gives him a headache. He really is. He's allergic to the idea. He likes one-on-one discussions because that's how you divide and rule your opponents. You don't get them to be in the same room, and you don't have to waste hours listening to every single one of them rabbiting on their view of the world. And he puts his preemptive strike in. So it's not that, unlike Reagan, who said to them, do this or I will give you the tariffs, tariffs that you will never forget. He starts with the tariffs, and then in the one-on-one discussions with each of our leaders, hapless leaders, I should say, he demands different things from different people, depending on what they have to give him. And I think that's what he's going to try to do. As for the markets, listen, look, between leftists now, right? We don't have the moral or mental right, on the one hand, to say, as we say correctly, that when stock exchanges go through the roof, that this is no sign of shared prosperity, that stock exchanges can go all the way up while the majority of people in the majority of countries suffer. We can't say that, which is correct to say, and at the same time say, oh my God, look, the stock exchanges are collapsing, this is calamity. Well, let's be nuanced. It could be that a collapsing global share market brings about a calamity for the little people, for the lower classes, like in 2008, but it's not necessarily the case. Already today, I can see that the markets are having second thoughts about their panic. And as I said, the moment he unleashes these horrible, horrible tax cuts for fat cats, I have no doubt that markets will recover very quickly.
Yanis, can we just dial in on sort of Trump's intentionality or rationale? Because I don't disagree with you, right? That I think he's a beast driven by ego in a way that a few other people actually are, and he wants to have, whether it's someone from Burkina Faso or Lesotho, or a smaller nation in terms of GDP, sort of banging on the White House, or not even the White House, an embassy's door, begging for these tariffs to be lifted. He wants American CEOs coming to pay tribute and pay homage to the king, and ask for carve outs, different deals to be done that benefit their industry. Oh, can we just have this part? Can we just get this critical mineral? Whatever it is, he enjoys being the deal breaker. He enjoys being, and obviously as well, there's a ginormous opportunity for corruption, right, in all of these places. But surely, the potential destabilization, the introduction of chronic uncertainty into the global economy, and I guess the destruction of American soft power as a trading and military partner within the sort of the Western world, it seems quite a high price. And I really struggle with the idea that there isn't any economic thinking, or that there isn't some degree of sort of economic intentionality in what he's trying to. Surely he must know or must desire a remodeling and remaking of the global financial and trade systems.
Of course, of course he does. It's all there in black and white. Read Stephen Miran's position paper. It's clear. What they want is they want to have their cake and eat it. They want to devalue the dollar without jeopardizing the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, the reserve currency status of the dollar. Is this far-fetched? No, it's not far-fetched. They may succeed in doing it. I'm not saying they will succeed in doing it, but what I'm saying is that they have a rational plan, a fiendish plan, as they would say in cartoons. But it is not, and it is not unprecedented. This is why I mentioned the 1970s, 1971. Richard Nixon did exactly the same thing. I mean, in his one of his autobiographies, I think he's written more than one, Henry Kissinger, in one of the chapters, that's from memory, I read it many years ago, he asks a question in one of the chapters. The chapter title is a question: who caused the oil crisis? And the first sentence is, we did. And he was very clear on this, that that myth that it was the Arabs and the OPEC, third world countries that imposed the high prices on America, that's all rubbish. Let's not forget who was in OPEC back then. It was the Shah of Iran, who was on the payroll of the CIA, the Suharto regime in Indonesia, utterly driven by the State Department and the CIA, Saudi Arabia, which can't move 1 inch without the okay of Washington, D.C. So why did they create this huge oil crisis then, if Kissinger is right? Why did, remember, Richard Nixon sent his Treasury Secretary to the Europeans with a message: the dollar mates are our currency, and from now on, it is going to be your problem. Nothing more aggressive has ever been sent to the Europeans. I don't think J.D. Vance said anything worse than that. Indeed, Paul Volcker, who much, much later became the president of the Federal Reserve, he was a member of that team, and he reports that it was Connolly, the Treasury Secretary, who convinced Nixon on the 15th of August of 1971 to blow up the Bretton Woods system with the following expression, and this is verbatim because it's etched in my memory when I read it. He said, "Mr. President, the foreigners are out there to screw us, and we must screw them before they screw us." And 2 days later, he blew up the Bretton Woods system. So everything you said, the major shock, the plan to devalue the dollar, the plan to enhance the dollar's hegemony, the plan to damage seriously its most important allies. Back then, it was Europe and Japan. Well, it's more or less the same now. That happened. It introduced enormous uncertainty. Lots of businesses in the United States suffered, including the markets. The working class was damaged beyond redemption in 1971, 72, 73. Remember, American hourly real wages have not recovered to the level that they had in 1973. To this day, they are lower than they were in 1973. So you talk about uncertainty, damage, carnage, and all that. Well, Nixon did it. That was the whole point of the Nixon shock. But you know what? It was utterly successful from his perspective. Why? Because he managed to create, I'm talking about Nixon now, through his shock, something that has never happened before in human history. Every hegemon, every empire, every large force, until 1971, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, before that the Roman Empire, every such power that went from being a surplus producer to a deficit producer lost its power. The United States is the only hegemon whose power has been enhanced by its deficits, and that's due to the Nixon shock. So when Trump's men, and as a small aside here, when people say that Trump is a very poor excuse for human nature, that he is inarticulate, that he is half crazy, all that applied to Nixon. Right? I mean, was there a man more despicable than Richard Nixon? And yet, the Nixon shock worked. What I find astonishingly ironic is that all these centrists around the world, in Europe, in Britain, in the United States, who are lamenting the great world that was destroyed by Donald Trump. What world are they lamenting, really? The one that was created by madman Richard Nixon's shock. Because everything we have been experiencing recently, taking for granted, globalization, neoliberalism, financialization, those were the results of a very deliberate plan by Richard Nixon.
So let's talk then about centrists. We'll start with the centrists in Britain, and then we can move to the centrists in Europe, Yanis. Keir Starmer declared that globalization is dead. It's over, which I think certain informed observers were wondering what took him so long perhaps to identify. How should the UK adapt to a world in which globalization is dead? Maybe even he'll go one step further and say that sort of neoliberalism's over, although I'm not so sure about that. Starmer's kind of said, we're going to respond cool, calm-headed. We've got a range of levers we can use in response, retaliatory tariffs, etc. But I think he's just
the benefits of the disabled.
Yeah. There's some other marginalised community we could make poorer in response to this. I mean, look, they're going to have to do something, right? Because Reeves's fiscal headroom has been evaporated again by these tariffs, right? So there will have to be so they could raise taxes, they could change the fiscal rules, or they could cut benefits for someone. I don't know, but yes, I just sort of.
I think they will do all that because they're lacking any sensible plan. Everything you said they will do. They will change the fiscal rules, they will tax more, they will attack some marginalized social group because they have no plan.
Well, God, that's an optimistic note, isn't it? When you put it as simply and bluntly as that.
Before we shift to optimism, we have to realize the predicament we find ourselves in. Otherwise, we're just fools, right? Look, the problem that Britain has is this. I remember when I moved to Britain in 1978. It was just before the winter of discontent. Britain at the time was in a very precarious position, but at least it had a business model that worked. There were several quite strong industries. They were fading. They were particularly inefficient, but at least there was a business model. You had these industries. You had council houses that made sure that there was no housing crisis in Britain when I moved to Britain in the late 1970s. And then Thatcher comes in and appends all that. The Nixon shock or the Trump shock was nothing like the Thatcher shock that I experienced in your country when I lived there. What she does is, she decides to financialize the housing market. So she takes the council homes and sells them to the working class, which of course then takes a huge amount of new debt. And once the working class is financialized, it ceases to be radical. Because when you owe to the banker, then it's not easy to strike. And then at the same time, she attacks the four main unions, the mine workers, the steel workers, the printers, and so on, the rail workers, closes everything down. So she uses the strategy of the American generals in Vietnam who, to get rid of the Viet Cong, to burn the whole place up, the jungle, with Agent Orange. So she did the same thing. She shut down all the major industries of Britain. So suddenly you have a business model which is based simply on financialization. You have the financialization of the house. You have public utilities that are being sold to the public as part of shareholders' democracy, but in a manner that ensure that within 48 hours, all the shares that were dispersed across Britain through selling them below their market value. They were sucked up, siphoned into the City of London, and suddenly you had the big monopolies owning British gas and so on. Uh, and that was a Ponzi scheme because it was only financialization which was allowing Britain to increase its GDP on the basis of essentially of hot air and of turning the country into a major um, deficit spender. You have a huge trade deficit, and essentially meaning that unless the City of London continues to attract foreign capital to keep buying out your country, then your country simply has no chance. Now, that was a very long term, slow burning Ponzi scheme, and it took a Trump or some kind of calamity to make sure that ends. And so when Keir Starmer says that globalization ends, effectively what he means is that the Ponzi scheme that Thatcher built and Tony Blair built upon, turbocharged, because this is what Blair and Brown did, that is over now. But Mr. Starmer, what is the plan now? There is no plan. The plan that a Labour government should be designing, putting together, and implementing should be all about converting the excessive liquidity in the financial circuits of the City of London into actual productive green investments for Britain. But Rachel Reeves is simply constitutionally, biologically incapable of conjuring up such a scheme, or even imagining that it is possible to have such a plan.
It contradicts her very nature. Yeah, I guess even last time you and I spoke in this studio I'm sat in now, we were talking about technofeudalism, and even the sort of the paltry measures by which the British state attempts to impose some degree of levy, a sort of 2% digital services tax, which raises hundreds of billions of pounds, by the way, for such a low sum, and they're sort of talking about scrapping that as well. So you're kind of, it's sort of, you look at what you feel it almost has like a disassociative effect on you, right? Because you without a particularly informed position, very few people know libertarian tech CEOs, but they look at the companies they run and they appear to be incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy, and they look at the way that they're not really touched by democratic organisations or ostensibly democratic organisations like the governments in the UK, for example, and you're sort of sat there wondering, well, why on earth there appears to be all of this money in our economic system. It's just me, the little guy, that keeps getting fucked. Why can't we do something to the big guys? And because of that, I guess you see this people checking out from politics, from media, from like civil society, because the world that they think they recognise, or that what appears so obvious to them, and you've got Rachel Reeves and Starmer's just sort of ignoring it, right? Or that would be impossible. We never could.
Well, because look, ever since Thatcher shifted Britain from an industrial society to a financialized society, it was rentier financial accumulation that ruled the roost in London. It's all about accumulating paper money, and to hell with industry, with making things. The fact that there are still some things being made in Britain is just a miracle of patriotism by individuals. And you just made me remember the venom with which the Labour Party was treated under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, because they had an industrial policy. They had a policy of creating a new investment bank, the National Investment Bank, that would work together with the Bank of England to divert billions away from this merry-go-round of paper money chasing after paper money into producing actual green investments. And whenever I spoke even to Tories who had anything to do with industry, they were very enthusiastic about that. Of course, they wouldn't dare say it in public or in front of a camera. But this, I think, is absolutely fascinating. The fact that if the minority of British industrialists who still survive, as opposed to financiers who thrive, they are, in a way, vassals in this almost feudal financial cloud system that we live in. But they have no voice, really. The British Chamber of Commerce is no longer interested in industry. They are no longer even representing the interests of people who actually make stuff, like, factories.
Just finally, Yanis, whether the UK has a deficit or a surplus or parity with the US, you can look at different studies. It's very close, right? The trading relationship between the two. You can't say the same about Europe, right? It's it's a quarter of a trillion, right? The surplus there. So when you're considering how the EU might respond to what's happening right now, what does that look like? What should that look like?
It's really very simple. As you said, when you have $240, $250 billion trade surplus with the United States, that is why you have austerity as the mainstay in Germany, because austerity keeps wages down to make German products in the United States competitive, but by keeping wages down, it keeps domestic demand down, and by keeping domestic demand down, it keeps investment down. For 15 years now, there's been zero net investment in Germany, zero. So the result is they've missed out on a whole technological revolution. And that's why Volkswagen can never now compete with BYD. There's no way that German industry can compete when it comes to, the Germans used to make the best solar panels in the world 20 years ago. Now they can't. They can't compete. Why? No investment. So the only alternative to permanent stagnation and this constant slide into irrelevance of mainland continental Europe, the only alternative to that is to boost investment in Europe by something like 700 billion euros every year, which requires a planning mechanism. It requires something like a federal ministry of finance to issue Eurobonds to be able to do that. Exactly that which Merkel and Schäuble and all the people that I knew and loved years ago ensured would never happen. We had a fantastic opportunity with the Euro crisis to do that, and they made sure that when the political capital existed to do it, it didn't happen. And now that the political capital doesn't exist, it can't happen. So we know what needs to be done, except that there is no political system by which to do it in Europe.
Excellent. Great news. I guess my last question is really, well, you could talk for hours, I guess, but is a quick one. Do you think he'll stay the path? Do you think he'll lift the tariffs? Do you think he'll whack China with more? He's talking about reciprocity, that he'll stick like another 50% on them or something crazy. Do you think he's going to stay the path with this? Do you think he'll keep tariffing people?
Do not pretend to understand the workings of the Donald's mind, but what I do know is that there is no way that he's going to recoil into the corner and say, I'm sorry for the 2nd of April, it wasn't Liberation Day, let's take this back. No, I think that he's going to continue. Look, the United States has gigantic powers of recovery. It is a closed economy. Its connection to the rest of the world may be significant, but it's not that large. It can recover very quickly. The Chinese, on the other hand, are equally versatile. They have developed a massive internal market. They now have only about 18% of their exports go to the United States. Even if they lose half of it, they can replenish it. They can replenish it primarily by boosting demand domestically, which I think now they have decided to do. So, more or less, I think the United States and China will be okay. The rest of us, that's a different story.
Different story for another day. Yanis Varoufakis, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. Great to talk to a failed finance minister from a failed state, as always. I'll speak to you again soon. Thank you, Yanis.
Thank you.